One of the reasons we felt it was important to have a group on race and racism is to put into context the disparities that we're trying to address in clinical trial and the representativeness in clinical trials. And so we had 4 papers, and among our 4 papers, a couple of papers that specifically focused on the concepts of structural racism, the history of structural racism in the United States, and then more specifically, the impacts of structural racism on the healthcare system and on health outcomes. We think this is a really important topic to now think about in the context of clinical trials. And as we move forward to writing and putting together the white paper, one of our goals will be to think about how the intersection between structural racism has worked with clinical trials at each level of clinical trial development, from conceptualization to funding to implementation, and then communication and publication. And at each of those nodes, you can imagine there's areas where the structural racism of the healthcare system and the biomedical research enterprise has led to exacerbating the disparities that we're working to address. Okay, so now we got our slides going. I guess what we're seeing now is some comments that got put on sticky notes for each of the papers. So of course, partnerships are essential. We need industry involved. This comes from one of the papers we discussed, and this was a paper that specifically looked at precision medicine and structural racism, and we thought this is a really useful framework where they identify specific nodes in the process and factors that are either promoting or working against some of the disparities that we see in the precision medicine side of things. So we think community and cultural wealth, racially represented PIs leaders are assets of clinical trials. Again, part of the system itself, if we are not representing our diverse population in the workforce, then that's only going to contribute to the disparities we see in the enrollment. Measure it. That comment about measuring it is in response to a question that got raised about, should we be race blind in our research? And I think when we talk about addressing racism, you cannot do that without talking about race. And so it's critical that clinical trials report on the people who were enrolled, including their race and ethnicity. And sometimes that's not included in the report, and then you're not able to see the level of disparity that may exist. It has to be intentional. The system right now is working to give us the result we currently have, so if we're passive, we'll keep getting the same result. The only way to have something new is to change the system or work against it, and that's what we mean when we talk about systemic and structural racism. So I don't want to take up everyone's time. We have a lot of really awesome comments. If you want to come work with us, we're happy to take more people.
So we had a very interesting paper specifically on race-based corrections for algorithms from the New England Journal of Medicine, and this is obviously a very salient topic. What was surprising to myself as a cardiologist, where this is very prevalent, is that this is really prevalent across all fields. There are clinical indicated conditions that have race as a factor. And we, as a group, all concluded that there's really no role for this, and race is being used as a proxy for things that are much harder to measure. Now, if these kind of race corrections help people get more treatment, get care sooner as a screening tool, they may be helpful, but they have no biological roles, as the paper said. Again, and I think my colleague Shoa mentioned all these themes. Again, we have to be very active in changing things because the system is based on historical practices that are still very much alive. One thing that we really liked was talking about, I said about cultural competence around cultural humility, and we had a great example from one of our group members saying that she approaches every interaction with patients, participants as, hello, friend. That may be a little bit less typical in our clinical encounters, but again, making no assumptions and really trying to get information from our patients and participants of what matters most to them. And again, these were our papers. Not making assumptions based on race, using pre-canned definitions of race. Sometimes how you see an individual patient or participant is very different from how they identify, so make sure it's self-identification, and that's really what matters. And again, one thing that was surprising to some in our group is that it's not just socioeconomic disparities. Even within the same socioeconomic status, there are prominent disparities by race. So this matters. Structural racism is the cause of this. And especially for that algorithmic one, don't assign group level differences to an individual. The way that paper described is these are still table 1 characteristics, which are very important. You want to know who's in your study, but don't assign biological values to individuals. One thing that, again, was not discussed in the papers, but we said this suggests that as we think of AI algorithms, especially in the clinical trial world where we can identify participants, the AI is just as good as the data that goes in, and the data has disparities, which all data does. These disparities will persist. Creating a safe space is important for patients, medical audiences, especially when there are power differences, which is inherent in clinical trials and research. And again, this is not the individual. This is a multi-level approach. These solutions have to be at the policy level, at the education level, and it requires investments from our partners.
I'm Paul Wong. I'm going to talk on behalf of our group on FDA guidance. First of all, we wanted to emphasize the really potential that this can be truly transformative for all of the diversity in our clinical trials. So that's the very first point we wanted to make. So indeed, there is an opportunity for greater clarity. We're all aware of this. Obviously, this is only a guidance document in a draft form. In addition, we're not clear really on how the FDA is going to decide, what are going to be the bars for approval, in what sense will that be determined, and it extends both to approval and post-market surveillance as well. So there are a number of opportunities to expand beyond FDA, and a number of comments as you see here. Relatively speaking, some of the focus is narrow. As you know, CMS plays a very important part in really what happens in our healthcare system in terms of the largest payer. And so, our group talked about different ways that CMS could be a leader in this, paying, for example, for non-covered individuals as part of the process of clinical trials, we believe would significantly increase diversity. Other areas in terms of, again, payers, incentives to pay. As you'll see, one of the papers was about infrastructure, which we'll talk about further. Comments about general, broadening the safety involved in both patients and research staff. Kind of as an aside, but a very critical component in terms of diversity of clinical trials is really making it feasible for participants to participate. And this is really essential for diversity. So things like going to where the patient is, providing services in their home, et cetera, and outreach. So we talked about different categories, the importance of different categories and different strategies. Obviously, there needs to be an expansion beyond drugs, including devices, et cetera. So this is one of the papers, the guidance from 2016. We had some additional comments, and then another paper that really looked at ways to enhance diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. Really a very ambitious project that was had multiple sponsors. This is a more recent document, a 2020 document for guidance for industry from FDA. This was about incentives, and there are a number of comments that we'll make about this, I think, that we have listed. Oh, okay, I'll have to ad lib on that. Okay, so so some of these were further regarding incentives. We talked about the CMS incentive. There were additional comments about how to address racism at institutions. One suggestion was to require anti-bias training for all investigators, so adding that to city training, which we did not believe was included. One other suggestion, one of the papers is regarding creating an infrastructure. That was the city study. And so what they're talking about is that we generally focus on what happens at the individual site. That is, how do we help sites, and for individual studies, I mean. But in actuality, there's really a need to create an overall culture change at most institutions, starting with leadership, CEO, et cetera, that supports diversity and dedicating resources. So this study, this paper is around doing that. Some of our suggestions in particular would be to, one, create a consortium of industry where they would contribute, because the real issue is the dollars. And so we don't think that it's really sustainable for, though this document says, oh, you should spend millions and millions of dollars, each institution, towards diversity. That's not going to work at many institutions, particularly the institutions where we're probably most interested in. And so we thought that it would be very reasonable that there be a consortium of industry, and that they, in fact, would invest in these centers, that they then, these institutions that would be then used, creating a true consortium. Another concept was that NIH grants, particularly certain grants and CTS grants, might require a matching funding for more infrastructure that's specifically dedicated to diversity. And so that would be another area.
Well, it's been a very, very informative session so far, so I'm hoping everyone is enjoying it. So I'm speaking on behalf of clinical trial design and statistical method. So we had 4 papers. So one was the culture change within research. The first paper was how do we build trust within our patients? And one of the things that, and then the broader concept about like retaining all these patients and increasing inclusivity and increasing the diversity, it really needs a culture change, and that culture change not within the cancer center, but also when we look at patients with cancer, there's a lot of mental health and depression issues that we need to kind of address. So one of the things that I think we have to do is adopting this culture in other disciplines. I'm kind of fortunate to be in that space where in cancer research we do look at many facets in patient care, but I think other disease groups also have to kind of follow that lead. I think we have a very optimistic overview of our treatment, so I think that's one thing that we discussed. When we start a clinical trial or even think about a question, I think we have to have a written checklist of things of what do we do when we start a clinical trial. Really have to take a step back and talk to people who are like funding these trials and really make sure what is important for our patients, what is meaningful to them, what are the questions that we're asking, and if that resonates with our patients. In the same paper where we were talking about the trust, again, incorporating patient advisory council that also includes patients' families, making sure that we are being held accountable. Like when we are designing clinical trials and when we are getting our patients through the various steps, make sure that there's accountability and they're not missing any steps. So that's a really important thing when we are forming these advisory councils, including patient's family. Be intentional in study design from early on. Again, I touched a little bit about it. Our questions that we ask, we may be thinking about like a scientific question, but we also have to meet the patients. Is that outcome or that endpoint really meaningful to them? So just taking these small steps early on. I think it touches on the same points and making sure that our patients, we really think about what's meaningful to our patients when it's the endpoints. Access to clinical trials, I think this is really important when we are talking about patients who are living in rural areas. When we talk about doing various interventions, what can we do to make that accessible to the patients? Can we think about, a little bit outside the box? Can there be interventions that can meet patients where they are, not vice versa? So we talked about when we are doing this, when we think about a study design, can there be interventions that can be done remotely? For example, mobile labs that can just go to patients and collect some of the data there rather than they coming to us? Or can we partner with our community physicians where they can administer drugs and we can have the oversee. So I think these are the things that we have to incorporate early in the design. It's not after the fact. I think this is something really that goes beyond when we are writing the protocol, thinking about the problem, where the problem is, and what can we do to make it less burdensome to our patients. Again, e-consents, I think we have started incorporating them, but I don't think that is a uniformly accepted. Or if there are some regulatory challenges, can we do something to ease them where we can at least consider having these on larger phase 3 trials where we are not having patients come in and drive 4 hours just to consent on a trial. The other paper that we had talked about is there is about 10% of patients on clinical trials actually withdraw. And what are the factors? I think we have to think about them early on. Is it really burdensome for the patient? Are we being honest to them? Is there a placebo incorporated in that trial? And are we really being truthful to them about what it takes, their time commitment, their loss of work, or is it an AE that we haven't talked to them about, or the side effects that we haven't really discussed to them, I haven't been honest with them. And hopefully, if we are honest with our patients and we think about those things early on, so we may decrease the rate of withdrawals. The other thing is the patients who get off the trial, how do we account for their work? Is there a way that we can do analysis and still capture that data? There are some cultural factors that sometimes are really important to consider when we are consenting an individual. Like, is it a family consent versus an individual consent? Are we trying to explain a consent to the family, or is it for the patient? I think those things have to be kept in mind. Sometimes our patients are not understanding the consent very, very well and rely on their family, which may not have similar goals than our patients. I think keeping that in mind. Again, this is facilitating our clinical trial, not only accrual, but also retention. So we all get very excited about putting patients on trial, but then you look at the real life challenges that some of our patients, especially from the lower socioeconomic society, we have high parking rates that they have to bear, and how can we mitigate those things? I think these have to be factored in. Earlier we talked about the budget being, being intentional about that. Can we incorporate some of those things in the budget early on, where we are not thinking about these small things? They may be trivial, but that's for that patient that may mean a lot. Well, this is a lot to kind of decipher. Is your decision truly informed? I think that's something that is not an easy statement. I think we have to go beyond just the ICF, like the informed consent when you're talking about. We have to make sure the patient understands, and some of the things that we have to keep in mind is the language barrier sometimes that can be, and we sometimes think that patient has understood it, and early on, I think one of the lectures we talked about that how it's not patient's problem that they don't understand, it's our problem that we're not communicating them to them in their language. And there is going to be guidance about how, Dr. Bieber is sitting there, how to really make patients understand what a phase of a trial is. We don't know how to say that, but hopefully we can all we can get some training on how to really talk to our patients about clinical trials. So article enhancing diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. some of the things that we talked about was justice and equity in pragmatic clinical trials. The things that we talked about was, am I going too fast there? Okay. So justice and equity, the few things we talked about in this paper was really having our patients, the navigators or people who talk to our patients be from that community. Like, how do we think about that early on? Like, we have to really recruit patients or patient-facing research staff that represent that part of patient population and be intentional about that. Provide them with adequate training so that they speak somewhat of like same language there. For our next paper, patient-centered clinical trial design, this paper we talked about, really going back when we start thinking about, a protocol, going back to our patients or patients with living experiences, community advisors, and see what the questions that we have to ask. Involve our patients early on in designing a trial, and what are the resources that need to facilitate that.
I just want to thank Latha and Eldrin for just putting together such an amazing conference. I mean, I've learned a lot, and these are things that I'm going to take to my research programs, and so I'm really happy to have had all the wonderful conversations that we had today. So I just want to touch on a few themes. I think one of the papers that we talked about summarizes several of the themes that we talked about today throughout the talks in the morning and then the conversations. So in this study, this was out of UCSF. This is a brain health registry study where they were having trouble. Getting Hispanic participation. So they got extra funding to enroll a greater number of Hispanic patients, and so they wanted to do this digitally. So they hired this marketing company. They brought in community workers to help design materials to help get more participants in. It was expensive. That's one theme. It takes resources. So they spent over $250,000 or something like that to get about 3,500 participants in. So it was expensive, but it was successful. They got these participants in. And it took time, it took resources, but one of the things that they found, and this is, again, another theme, is that the proportion of participants who actually went through and finished everything, all the modules in this registry, was only 6%. So they were able to get the participants in, but then just to get them to complete everything, it was more of a challenge. And I think that one of the themes that came up today was this idea that what we all hope is that digital tools will make it easier, that they'll decrease the barriers to enrolling in these trials, and that we'll get these underrepresented groups participating in these studies. And to a certain degree, that may be true, but I think one thing that we talked about over and over was we have to understand how our communities use tools, digital tools, differently. So some communities will be text only. Some communities will go on Facebook. In this study, for example, halfway through their trial, they were using Facebook and Google and YouTube and so on, but in the end they realized, oh, only Facebook is working. So they dropped everything else and used only Facebook. And we were talking about how some communities don't use WhatsApp or other chats. They use WeChat for various reasons. So I think just like in the real world, you understand your community. And what works in your community, you have to understand that in the digital world as well. So that was a major theme. A lot of the other themes that came up have been already discussed by panelists. Make things easy. Just decrease the barriers as much as you can to allow more participation. Because we talked about the idea that for the IRB and other security measures, you you might be inclined to make things more secure and safer, but at the same time might be a little bit unnecessary and make it more difficult for people who already have some difficulty accessing these technologies, and to increase the barriers that way doesn't make as much sense. We also talked about, how do we get into these communities? Going outside of the digital space, the concepts that came up today were around community. How do we get? What does it mean to have boots on the ground and get the community engaged? And we talked about the idea that there's a desire from groups like ours to get into the communities where these underrepresented groups are. And what's our gateway there was often it's the physicians working in these community centers, but maybe they're not interested or they're not incentivized. They don't necessarily have time or resources to participate. So we have to learn how to provide that. And one member talked about the idea that she just stopped doing sort of investigator ideas, running trials based on her ideas, but just went to the community physicians and said, look, what do you guys need to do? What do you guys think is important to study? And she brought those ideas and got funding for them, and then got those physicians who brought up those ideas engaged because that's what they wanted to do. So I think concepts like that can get a lot of our research programs off the ground. All right, so those are just some thoughts. Thank you.
The overarching theme of our conference revolved around establishing links among various stakeholders to facilitate insightful and significant conversations addressing the existing lack of diversity in clinical trials. By fostering these collaborations, as we've had today, we aim to generate practical and inventive recommendations that can enhance the enrollment of underrepresented groups in clinical trials and advance the science of diversity within such clinical trials. I had conversations with people today, and we are all excited to move beyond anecdote to evidence, and that's what this group will do. We are uniting academic, government, industry, and community partners to promote diversity in clinical trials, to promote health equity, to understand needs, and to identify barriers and brainstorm together solutions to shape best practices and forge opportunities for future collaboration. As Dr. Lewis emphasized, it is our responsibility to actively address the lack of diversity we see in clinical trials. This issue directly impacts patient and public health outcomes.
The real work is taking all of these lessons learned, all of the things that we've learned from each other, and first and initially translating that into a series of white papers to actually be able to disseminate it more broadly beyond the 150 people who attended today. But then we have to go back to our various institutions and organizations and hold each other accountable. Is it going to be easy? Absolutely not. Do we have the solutions for every aspect? No. And will there be some consequences to decisions that are made? Absolutely. But if we chip away one step at a time and say, what are the barriers to this implementation? Now let's do it. Then what we're going to see is 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and definitely 20 years from now, we're not going to be in the same position where we're even talking about this as something that we need to initiate. Thank you for the beginning. Take care.